The desperate message. The wind howled outside the colony's main communications hub as Lieutenant Adam Stevens sat in front of a flickering screen. His tired eyes scanned the data, but his mind wasn't on the numbers or codes. It had been a long day, and his body ached for rest. But then something caught his attention. A strange, urgent message had come through from deep space. Adam leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. The message's sender was unknown, and the location was far from any known colony. The message itself was brief, but haunting. "We need help. They are coming. If you don't answer, we won't survive." His fingers froze over the keyboard. He had read it multiple times, but it still didn't make sense. Who were they? What did the message mean by they? A cold shiver ran down Adam's spine. The message had come from a distant, uncharted planet. It was a warning, not just a call for help. He looked over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to walk in and offer an explanation. But the room was empty. His own thoughts seemed louder than the hum of the station's equipment. Should they respond? Could they trust a message like this? Who would send a message like that? Why hadn't they said exactly what was happening? The silence was broken by the soft beep of the communication system. Adam blinked, and his fingers moved instinctively. He opened the message again, trying to make sense of it. "They are coming," echoed in his mind. Was it a threat? A plea? Something far worse. The screen blinked, and a new line of text appeared, followed by a series of distorted images. They were blurry, too difficult to decipher clearly, but one thing was certain. The faces of the people in the images were filled with fear, fear that was palpable, even through the cracked images. Adam leaned in closer, squinting at the broken visuals, his heart racing. These weren't just random survivors asking for help. Something terrible was happening to them. A voice crackled through the speakers, an audio message following the same unsettling pattern as the rest. "We are dying. Please, help us, the creatures." The voice broke off in a sharp gasp. Then there was only static. Adam's breath caught in his chest. He'd heard enough. The sound of footsteps approaching from behind made him jump, and he quickly turned around to see Captain Rachel Morris standing in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable as she crossed the threshold and walked toward him. "What is it, Stevens?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Captain Morris was always serious, never one to show much emotion. But there was something in her eyes now, a spark of concern. Adam motioned for her to look at the screen. "It's a distress call, Captain. From a planet in the uncharted system. It's not like anything I've seen before. The message, it's urgent and terrifying." Rachel read the message, her face growing more solemn with each word. "We've had distress calls before," she said after a long pause. "But this one, this feels different." She glanced at the screen, deep in thought. Adam watched her carefully, waiting for her next words. The air between them was thick with tension. "What do you think we should do?" he asked, his voice steady, though he could feel his nerves getting the best of him. Rachel sighed and rubbed her temples. "I don't like it, but if we don't respond, they might be in more danger than we can imagine. Maybe we're the only chance they have." She looked back at the screen. "We'll need to prepare a team. We're sending someone out there." The thought of sending a team into the unknown unsettled Adam, but the captain's decision was final. The question now wasn't whether to go, but how to prepare for whatever lay ahead. He felt the weight of the choice press down on him. It wasn't just about responding to a call for help anymore. Something was off. He could feel it in his bones. As Rachel left to make preparations, Adam stayed at his station, staring at the message. His mind raced with possibilities. What if this wasn't just a cry for help? What if it was something far worse? Something that would put their colony at risk. The colony was relatively safe, isolated from the dangers of the galaxy's more dangerous regions. But the fear in the voices, the desperate tone of the message, it all hinted at something worse than just a simple distress signal. Something darker. Something that didn't belong. Adam's fingers hovered over the keyboard again, He considered sending a message back, asking for more details. But then he hesitated. The transmission was already too distorted. There was no way to get more information without risking something even more dangerous. He clenched his fists, trying to steady his nerves. Whatever was happening on that distant world, they had no choice but to respond. But Adam couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap, one that would change everything. The unknown planet loomed larger in his mind, its secrets hidden beneath layers of fear and uncertainty. As he left the communications hub to join the rest of the team, a single thought ran through his head. What if we're not the ones who need to be rescued? The weight of that question gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the message they had received was only the beginning of something far darker, something that was coming for them, whether they were ready or not. The decision to respond. The colony's main conference room was silent, the only sound coming from the soft hum of the overhead lights. Around the large table, the leaders of the colony sat, each lost in their own thoughts. Adam Stevens stood at the head of the table, still uneasy from the strange message that had arrived only hours earlier. Beside him stood Captain Rachel Morris, her expression as serious as ever. Both of them knew this wasn't a normal distress signal. Something about it felt off, but they had no choice but to make a decision. Rachel cleared her throat, breaking the tense silence. "We have to decide," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The message is clear. They're asking for help. But we don't know what we're walking into. What if it's a trap? What if they're not the victims they claim to be?" Adam could feel the weight of her words. The room was filled with uncertainty. Some of the officers around the table shifted in their seats, clearly uneasy with the idea of responding. Others seemed more eager to take action, but none of them knew what was at stake. "We can't ignore it," a voice called from the back. It was Lieutenant Sarah James, a seasoned officer known for her level-headed thinking. "If we don't respond, who knows what might happen to them? We could be the only ones capable of saving them. And if we don't go, if something happens to them, and we didn't even try, how will we live with that?" Her words rang true. Adam glanced at Rachel, who was carefully considering every angle. The decision wasn't easy. Responding to the distress call meant stepping into the unknown, possibly facing whatever danger had been hinted at in the message. But the risk of doing nothing was even worse. Rachel finally broke the silence, her voice steady. "Sarah's right. We can't turn our backs. If we don't help them, who will? We might be the only hope they have left. Prepare a team. We're going in." Adam nodded, his stomach sinking as he realized the gravity of their choice. The message had left more questions than answers, and he wasn't sure if they were making the right decision. But there was no going back now. They had to act. The room erupted in a mix of agreement and nervous murmurs. Some officers were eager to move out, but others seemed unsure, glancing at each other with uncertainty. The unknown was a dangerous thing, and no one knew just how dangerous it really was. "We'll need a plan," Adam said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We don't know what we're walking into. I suggest we prepare for the worst." Rachel nodded, and Adam could see the tension in her eyes. She, too, was starting to feel the weight of the decision. If the Deathworlders, the creatures mentioned in the message, were real, and if they truly were coming, the colony's survival could depend on how quickly they responded. "We'll send a recon team first," Rachel said. "Small, quiet, just to gather intel. No contact unless absolutely necessary. Adam, you're leading it. I trust you to make the right call out there." Adam swallowed, his mind racing. A recon mission made sense. They couldn't risk sending a full team without knowing what they were up against. But the thought of stepping into an unknown situation, with no idea of what awaited them, was still unsettling. The message had been too vague, too mysterious. The fear in the voices of the people who sent it, the terror that seemed to seep through every word, made his nerves twist in knots. He glanced at his team, who were already beginning to gather their equipment. Sarah James, who had always been calm under pressure, was checking her gear with precise movements. A few others on the team looked equally as prepared, but Adam noticed a few faces that showed the same unease he felt. This was no ordinary mission. They weren't just going out to gather information. They were stepping into a nightmare. The captain turned back to Adam. "Get your team ready. We'll launch in 2 hours." Adam nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. What were they really heading into? What had happened to the people who had sent the message? And most importantly, what did they mean by "they are coming"? The unease that had started the moment he first saw the message only grew stronger now. Adam couldn't shake the feeling that there was something worse lurking out there. Something they wouldn't be prepared for, no matter how many weapons they brought, or how careful they were. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Adam and his team went through their equipment checks, making sure everything was in order. Each member of the recon team would be armed and ready for anything, but there was a strange sense of dread in the air. They were about to enter a situation they couldn't control. As they boarded the transport ship, Adam couldn't help but glance out the window at the stars beyond. It felt like they were heading straight into the unknown. The ship's engines hummed to life, and soon they were leaving the safety of the colony behind, heading toward the planet that had sent the call. The darkness of space stretched endlessly before them, and for the first time, Adam felt truly small. The thought of what they might find on that distant world consumed his mind. What if the message was a warning, not for help, but for something worse? Something that had already claimed the planet's inhabitants. He looked around at his team. Some of them had their eyes fixed on the screens in front of them. Others were silently preparing for what was to come. But none of them spoke. It was as if everyone knew that words wouldn't change what was about to happen. No one knew what they were going to face, but one thing was certain. They couldn't turn back now. And so, with their hearts heavy and their nerves high, they flew toward the unknown. The arrival of the Deathworlders. The journey through space felt like it lasted forever. The transport ship hummed steadily as it cut through the void, the stars outside barely visible through the thick metal windows. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was tense. The crew of the recon team sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Adam Stevens stared at the readouts on his console, trying to focus, but his mind kept wandering back to the message. They are coming. What did it mean? Who were they? The message had left more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: they were about to find out. The communication console beeped suddenly, jolting Adam from his thoughts. He glanced up, noticing the signal from the planet was growing stronger. They were getting closer. The unknown world loomed ahead on the ship's screens, its surface hidden by swirling clouds. No signs of life, no evidence of any other ships. Just a barren, silent world that seemed to whisper of danger. Approaching the planet's atmosphere, Sarah James, the communications officer, called out, "We'll be in range for landing in 15 minutes." Adam nodded but didn't speak. His mind was elsewhere, his thoughts still on the message. The sense of dread that had been building for hours was starting to grow heavier. The unknown was terrifying, and as they drew closer to the planet's surface, that terror only deepened. "Everyone stay alert," Adam said, breaking the silence. "We don't know what's down there. It's a priority to gather intel, not engage unless absolutely necessary." His team acknowledged his orders with nods, but Adam could see the unease on their faces. They all knew something was off. They had to be ready for anything. The transport ship descended slowly, cutting through the atmosphere with a smooth but eerie grace. The surface of the planet came into view, a desolate, rocky terrain stretching for miles. There were no signs of any civilization, no markers that indicated anything of interest, just endless stretches of barren land. "Touchdown in 5, the pilot called out, his voice filled with tension. "Prepare for landing." Adam's stomach churned as the ship began to dip lower. The reality of what they were about to face was setting in. This wasn't just a standard mission. This was something far more dangerous. The planet's surface appeared deserted, but the haunting feeling that something was waiting for them refused to leave. The ship finally landed with a soft thud, the engines powering down. The hatch opened, and a blast of cold, stale air rushed inside. Adam stepped forward, his boots hitting the metal floor as the rest of the team followed. The outside world was quiet, too quiet. The wind barely stirred, and the sky above them was a pale, lifeless gray. The only sound was the faint hum of their equipment and the distant, unsettling echo of silence. "Keep your eyes open," Adam ordered as he stepped off the ship, the team following closely behind. They were now standing on the barren surface of the planet. The ground was cracked and dry, like a desert that had seen no rain for centuries. The air tasted faintly metallic, and Adam felt a strange chill crawl down his spine. They advanced cautiously, weapons at the ready, scanning the landscape for any signs of life. There was nothing. No movement, no sounds, just an overwhelming emptiness. Adam could see nothing but dust and rocks, the occasional craggy mountain in the distance. Yet, as they moved deeper into the terrain, Adam felt the strange sensation that they were being watched. Suddenly, Sarah's voice broke the stillness. "Lieutenant, over here." Adam turned to find Sarah crouched near a pile of rubble. She was examining something half buried in the dirt. As he walked over, his heart sank. It was a body. No, several bodies. They were scattered around the area, their features twisted in a grotesque expression of fear. The bodies were of the same people who had sent the distress signal. Their clothing was torn, their faces frozen in terror. Adam's breath caught in his throat as he looked at them. The fear on their faces was unmistakable. Whatever had happened to them, it had come suddenly and violently. He didn't need to see more to know that they had not died peacefully. The terror that had gripped them was apparent even in death. "We need to keep moving," Adam said quietly, trying to push back the unease that was slowly turning to dread. "We can't afford to stay here." The team nodded, but Adam could see the worry in their eyes. The bodies were a grim sign of what lay ahead. Whoever or whatever had attacked them wasn't finished. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, and Adam couldn't shake the thought that they weren't alone. As they continued to move forward, the ground underfoot began to shift. The rocks, the dust, they weren't natural. They looked almost as if they were deliberately placed. And then Adam saw it, strange, twisted shapes in the distance. They were hard to make out at first, but as they came closer, the true horror became clear. Massive, towering creatures stood just beyond the horizon, their silhouettes casting long shadows across the planet's surface. They were nothing like anything Adam had ever seen before. Their forms were hulking and monstrous, with multiple limbs and glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through the shadows. They were enormous, too large to be natural inhabitants of this world. Adam's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the creatures. The sense of terror and dread intensified. These were the Deathworlders the message had warned about. But what were they doing here? And why had they attacked the colony's visitors? Before Adam could process the situation, one of the creatures turned its massive head in their direction. Its eyes glowed bright with an unnatural intensity. Time seemed to stop as the creature locked onto their position, its body beginning to move slowly in their direction. The team froze, weapons raised, but they knew it was already too late. The Deathworlders were aware of them. The encounter with the unknown. The silence that followed the Deathworlders' first movement was deafening. For a moment, Adam Stevens thought his heart had stopped. His fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon as he tried to steady his breath. The massive creatures, towering over the landscape, were now fully aware of their presence. And though they hadn't yet advanced, the way the creature's glowing eyes fixed on them felt like a predator locking in on its prey. "Don't move," Adam whispered, his voice barely a breath. His team instinctively froze, but there was no mistaking the fear now written on their faces. These creatures weren't like anything they'd ever encountered. They were monsters, powerful, alien, and far beyond what any of them could have imagined. The air felt thick with tension as Adam surveyed the creatures. They stood motionless, almost like statues, their grotesque forms looming over the cracked ground. Their limbs were disproportionate, long and segmented in a way that looked unnatural. Jagged spines protruded from their bodies, their skin a sickly shade of dark green that shimmered in the dim light of the dying sun. Their eyes were wide and unnaturally bright, glowing with an eerie, almost predatory light. "We need to get to cover," Sarah James muttered from behind Adam, her voice barely audible but filled with urgency. Adam didn't need to be told twice. He quickly motioned for the team to retreat toward the abandoned buildings nearby. The creatures hadn't moved yet, but Adam knew they were waiting for something. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, like the calm before a storm. They ran swiftly, keeping low to the ground as they made their way toward the ruins of what was once a thriving settlement. As they reached the edge of a crumbled wall, Adam signaled for them to halt and crouch. He could hear the low hum of the Deathworlders in the distance, almost like a deep growl vibrating through the air. His skin prickled, and every instinct told him they weren't safe. "What the hell are they?" Lieutenant Sarah James hissed, her eyes wide in disbelief. "Not sure," Adam muttered, his gaze still locked on the hulking figures just beyond the horizon. He could barely make out their movements now, but he could see the shadows growing longer as they began to close in. The team was silent, hearts pounding, sweat clinging to their foreheads. Adam tried to steady his breathing. They hadn't been spotted yet, but it was only a matter of time before the Deathworlders sensed them. They had to act fast. Adam's mind raced with options. They couldn't fight these creatures head-on, not without better preparation. Their weapons were designed for defense, not combat with something like this. But the team couldn't just hide and wait to be discovered. They had to learn more, figure out what these creatures wanted, and if possible, get out alive. Before Adam could give an order, there was a sudden sound, a low, reverberating noise that made his blood run cold. The ground beneath them trembled, and from the corner of his eye, Adam saw the first Deathworlder take a deliberate step forward. The creatures were moving. "Move," Adam barked, his voice cracking through the tension. Without hesitation, the team dashed deeper into the ruins, scrambling over debris and trying to stay out of sight. Adam's heart pounded as they ran, each step feeling heavier than the last. The weight of the unknown pressed down on him, each passing second feeling like a countdown to something worse. Behind them, the sounds of the creatures grew louder, their heavy footsteps reverberating through the air like thunder. Adam didn't dare look back. If they were going to survive this, they needed to keep moving. Suddenly, a sharp crack pierced the air, followed by the sound of something large crashing to the ground. Adam didn't stop to investigate. He knew the creatures had heard them. They were closing in. "We're not going to make it," someone muttered. Adam didn't know who it was, but the words felt like a punch to the gut. The hopelessness in the voice was hard to ignore. "We have to keep going," Adam snapped. His voice was harder than he intended, but fear was eating at him. He could feel the pull of panic, but he had to push it down. The team needed a leader, and if he faltered, they all would. They turned a corner, finding themselves in what appeared to be the remains of a small settlement. Buildings were reduced to rubble, long-abandoned homes filled with the remnants of lives once lived. And then, amidst the ruins, Adam saw it, a large metallic structure, partially buried beneath the rubble. It wasn't a ship, but it was some kind of craft. The design was unfamiliar, its surface blackened by what looked like scorch marks. Adam's eyes widened as he realized it was not just abandoned. It was a shelter, a safe haven. But who had built it? And why had it been left behind? "Over there," Adam said, motioning for his team to head toward the strange craft. "Get inside. It might be a trap, but it's the best shot we have." The team sprinted toward the structure, desperation in every step. As they reached the door, they realized it was already partially open. Whoever had built it wasn't around anymore. And for a moment, Adam felt a flicker of hope, but that hope quickly died as he heard the unmistakable sound of the Deathworlders' growl. Closer now. Inside the structure, they found a dimly lit control room, filled with strange machinery and wires that seemed to hum with unnatural energy. It didn't look like anything they'd ever seen before. The walls were lined with alien symbols and warnings, none of which made sense. The air was thick with a strange energy, like they had stepped into a forgotten place of immense power. Adam quickly moved to a console, trying to make sense of the interface. But before he could even touch the controls, the sound of heavy footsteps outside the door grew louder. The creatures were almost upon them. "We don't have much time," Sarah said, her voice shaking. Adam had no choice but to take a risk. He had to activate whatever was in front of him. With a deep breath, he slammed his hand down on the closest button. A sudden hum filled the air, and the walls of the shelter seemed to come alive with light. The ground trembled again, this time stronger, as if the whole planet was reacting to the presence of the Deathworlders. The creature's growl reverberated louder. The room was spinning, and Adam could feel the grip of panic closing in. They had activated something, but what had they unleashed? The door creaked open. The shadows of the Deathworlders fell over the entrance, and Adam's blood ran cold. They were too close. The awakening. The silence that followed the sudden darkness was suffocating. Adam couldn't move. His limbs felt heavy, as if they were weighed down by some invisible force. His mind raced, struggling to make sense of what had just happened. One moment, he and his team had been cornered by the Deathworlders, their heavy footsteps closing in on them. The next, the world had gone black. Had they been captured? Had the creatures attacked? Adam's mind spun with questions, but there were no answers. For what felt like an eternity, Adam lay still, unable to tell if he was awake or still trapped in some nightmare. It wasn't until a faint buzzing sound filled the air, like the hum of machinery, that he realized something was different. The air was warmer now. The faint smell of something old, like metal and dust, was replaced by a strange, almost sterile scent, sharp and metallic. Slowly, he became aware of his surroundings. The darkness had lifted, and his vision slowly adjusted to the low, flickering light of the control room. He blinked, trying to clear his head. His hands were pressed flat against the floor beneath him, and the cold, hard surface sent a chill through his fingertips. "Captain." Sarah's voice broke through the silence, shaky and filled with disbelief. "Captain, are you all right?" Adam pushed himself up with effort, his head spinning. He could feel the weight of exhaustion pulling at him, but he fought it off. He needed to focus. "Yeah," he rasped, his throat dry. "I'm all right. Everyone else?" There was a pause before Sarah answered. We're here. We're all fine, but..." Her voice trailed off, and Adam heard her footsteps as she moved closer. Adam stood slowly, using the console for support. As his vision cleared, he saw that the rest of the team was sprawled out on the floor, groaning as they came to their senses. Lieutenant James, Corporal Allen, and the others were all stirring, blinking as they tried to get their bearings. The strange hum that had filled the air had stopped now, but something else lingered. A low, persistent vibration thrummed through the floor beneath them. It was almost as if the entire structure was alive. "What the hell just happened?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling with uncertainty. "I don't know," Adam replied, rubbing his temple. He could feel the lingering effects of the strange energy coursing through his body, but he forced himself to focus. He turned to the control console, staring at the screen in front of him. It flickered weakly, the once glowing symbols now dull and faded, as if the power had been drained. Before Adam could make sense of the controls, a loud crash echoed from outside the shelter. His heart skipped a beat, and his pulse quickened. The Deathworlders had to be close, too close. "We need to move," Adam said urgently. "Now." Sarah and the rest of the team immediately sprang to their feet, grabbing their weapons and moving toward the entrance. Adam hesitated for only a moment before following them. He didn't know what had caused the power failure or how long they had before the creatures outside found them. They had to get out of here. As they moved toward the door, Adam noticed something strange. The shelter, which had felt cold and lifeless moments ago, now hummed with energy. The walls flickered with weak light, and the floor seemed to pulse beneath his feet. "Something's happening," Sarah muttered, glancing around. "This place, it feels different now." Adam didn't have time to analyze the feeling. He motioned for the team to gather near the door. They weren't sure what was waiting for them outside, but they couldn't afford to stay inside for too long. The creatures were closing in, and if they didn't find a way to defend themselves, they would be caught. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the chaos outside. The Deathworlders were no longer just lurking in the distance. They were standing in front of the shelter, their enormous forms blocking the exit. There were at least 5 of them now, their grotesque features even more pronounced up close. Their glowing eyes fixated on the team with a predatory intensity that sent chills down Adam's spine. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The Deathworlders stood still, their massive bodies unmoving but alert. Adam's team was equally motionless, waiting for any sign of movement. The tension in the air was so thick, it could be cut with a knife. And then one of the Deathworlders made the first move. It raised one of its massive limbs, sharp claws glinting in the dim light, and slammed it down with a deafening thud, causing the ground beneath them to shake. The sound reverberated in Adam's chest, and his instincts screamed at him to run. But he held his ground, gripping his weapon tightly. "Stay together," Adam shouted. "Don't fire unless I say so." They waited, crouched low, eyes fixed on the Deathworlders. The creatures' movements were slow, deliberate, as if they were testing them. Adam could see the malice in their eyes, the hunger, and the raw violence in their posture. But then, to Adam's shock, the creatures did something he wasn't expecting. Instead of charging, they began to circle the shelter, their movements eerily coordinated, as if they were waiting for something. "Why aren't they attacking?" Sarah whispered. "I don't know," Adam muttered, his gaze fixed on the creatures. "But whatever it is, we need to find out fast." Then the ground trembled again. But this time, it wasn't just from the creatures' footsteps. A loud, mechanical roar filled the air as the structure beneath them began to shake. The walls flickered with light again, brighter this time. Adam felt a strange pull, a sensation that seemed to draw him toward the center of the shelter. Without thinking, he sprinted toward the control console. He didn't know why, but something was telling him that he needed to activate it again. The creatures outside hadn't attacked, but the energy was building in the structure. The hum in the air was growing louder, and Adam had a feeling that whatever force had brought them here, whatever technology was buried in this structure, was about to awaken. He slammed his hand on the console, and the entire shelter seemed to come alive. A sharp, bright light filled the room, and Adam was forced to shield his eyes. The air crackled with energy, and the ground trembled harder. From outside, the Deathworlders stopped circling. They were looking at the shelter now, their eyes glowing with an intensity Adam had never seen before. And then, as the shelter hummed louder, they began to move toward it. The awakening had begun, the choice of survival. The light from the shelter's console blazed brighter, cutting through the shadows of the barren landscape. Adam squinted against the intensity, his heart pounding in his chest. The Deathworlders had stopped circling. They were now standing still, their glowing eyes fixed on the shelter with an almost unnatural focus. The ground underfoot continued to hum with energy, and the walls of the structure seemed to pulse in response to the mounting tension outside. Adam's mind raced as he frantically tried to make sense of what was happening. What had they activated? Why were the creatures so fixated on the shelter now? And most terrifying of all, what did they want from it? "Get ready," Adam muttered to his team, his voice tight. They all knew this was the calm before the storm. He could see the fear reflected in their eyes. But they were professionals. They trusted him to lead them through this. Sarah James, her hand shaking slightly, adjusted the aim of her rifle as she kept her eyes on the door. "Captain, we can't just wait here. We need to get out. We'll be sitting ducks if we don't do something." Adam nodded, but he didn't move. The energy in the shelter was overwhelming now, making it feel like the air itself was alive with power. There was something he couldn't explain about the way the creatures were staring at them. It was almost as if they were waiting for something. Before he could respond, a sudden, loud roar cut through the air, sending a wave of panic through the team. One of the Deathworlders stepped forward, its massive form taking slow, deliberate steps toward the shelter. The ground vibrated with each movement it made, the earth shaking beneath them. Adam's breath hitched. This wasn't good. The creature's eyes were locked onto him now, and it seemed to be studying them. It wasn't just a mindless beast. It was intelligent, aware. And it was coming closer. "Everyone, fall back into the shelter," Adam ordered sharply, his mind racing for options. "We need to regroup." They all retreated into the heart of the shelter, away from the growing danger outside. But even as they did, Adam couldn't shake the feeling that the shelter was drawing them in. The walls seemed to pulse with an energy that made his skin crawl. The hum of the machinery filled the room, louder now, almost deafening. "This thing is alive," Corporal Allen whispered, his voice tinged with awe and fear. "Whatever's powering this, it's not natural." Adam couldn't argue with that. There was something undeniably alien about the technology surrounding them. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the machinery seemed to pulse with life as if it had a mind of its own. Yet the real question was, what was it waiting for? Why had it chosen them? A sudden loud thud echoed through the structure as another of the Deathworlders approached the door. This time, Adam could hear the deep growl of the creature, reverberating through the walls. He looked at his team, his mind spinning. They had to make a choice now. Stay here and risk being torn apart by the Deathworlders, or attempt to activate whatever was within the shelter and hope it was the key to survival. "We don't have much time," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "The creatures are closing in. We either fight or find a way out." Adam turned to face the console again. The energy in the shelter had reached its peak, and the vibrations beneath his feet were nearly overwhelming. He could feel the power coursing through the structure, but it was too much. He wasn't sure what would happen if he pressed another button, but he had no choice. He reached out, fingers trembling, and slammed his hand down on the central console. The entire shelter seemed to shudder, a violent jolt shaking the walls. Adam's heart raced as the lights flickered erratically, casting harsh shadows across the room. Then, just as quickly as the shaking began, it stopped. The humming noise cut off, and the room was filled with an eerie silence. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. The team stood frozen, unsure of what was happening. The tension was unbearable. And then, the ground trembled again. But this time, it was different. The earth seemed to split beneath them, and the shelter itself began to move. Adam stumbled backward, his heart in his throat as the entire structure seemed to lift off the ground. It was as if the building itself was coming to life, rising slowly into the air. "What the hell is happening?" Sarah gasped, her voice cracking with disbelief. "We're flying." The team scrambled to find their footing as the shelter continued to rise, lifting them higher and higher into the sky. Adam could barely process what was happening. The shelter was moving as if it were some sort of vehicle, but it wasn't just flying. It was accelerating, moving faster than anything they'd ever seen. And then, through the walls of the shelter, Adam saw something that took his breath away. The Deathworlders were following them, moving swiftly and relentlessly. They had been watching the shelter, and now they were moving in pursuit. "We're not safe," Adam muttered. "They're not giving up." The shelter continued to rise, breaking through the atmosphere, heading toward the stars. Adam could see the fading light of the planet beneath them as they soared higher into the sky. He didn't know where the shelter was taking them. But he knew one thing: the Deathworlders weren't going to let them go that easily. As the shelter ascended, the creatures' growls grew faint, but Adam knew they wouldn't stop. They had come here for a reason, and they would follow them wherever they went. Adam stumbled over to the console, desperately searching for a way to take control of the ship, or whatever this structure had become. But just as his fingers brushed the controls, a blinding flash of light filled the room. He felt a sharp, unnatural pull in his chest, and everything went black. The final choice. Adam's body jerked awake, his chest heaving with panic. He gasped for air, his head spinning as if he'd just been thrust through a vortex. His eyes fluttered open, but for a few moments, all he could see was blinding light, a brilliant white that swallowed his vision whole. Slowly, the light began to fade, and Adam found himself lying on a cold, smooth surface. His body ached as though he'd been struck by an invisible force. He sat up, feeling an overwhelming dizziness swirl through his mind. The last thing he remembered was the shelter taking off into the sky, the terrifying growls of the Deathworlders growing fainter as they ascended. But now he was somewhere completely different. The walls around him were no longer made of metal and strange alien symbols. They were translucent, shimmering in a way that was almost otherworldly, stretching out into a horizon of stars. He could see the vastness of space stretching out beyond the shelter, and though the sight was breathtaking, it also filled him with a deep sense of unease. "Captain." Sarah's voice broke through the thick silence. He turned to see her, along with the rest of the team, slowly rising to their feet, confusion and fear etched on their faces. They were all here, alive, but no longer on the planet they had just escaped from. No longer anywhere that made sense. "What the hell is going on?" Lieutenant James muttered, her eyes darting around the space. Adam pushed himself to his feet, his body still stiff from the strange, sudden transition. "I don't know, but we need answers. Fast." He stumbled toward the nearest console, trying to make sense of the unfamiliar interface. The controls were now glowing with soft blue light, and the once confusing symbols had transformed into something that resembled a map, albeit one of an unknown star system. There were no familiar constellations, no recognizable patterns, just a scattering of stars in the darkness. "We're not on Earth," Corporal Allen said quietly, as though stating the obvious. He looked out through the translucent walls, eyes wide as he took in the stars. Where are we?" "We're not just lost in space," Adam said, his voice low but filled with dread. "We're somewhere else, somewhere far beyond the reach of our world." The team fell silent, the weight of their situation pressing in on them like the atmosphere in a vacuum. They were in the unknown now, utterly alone in a vast, uncharted universe. The Deathworlders were still somewhere out there, but now they had another problem on their hands. Where were they? And what had caused this strange, sudden journey? Adam's hand hovered over the console, and then he pressed one of the glowing buttons. The control panel lit up, displaying a series of cryptic symbols, and the shelter's surroundings flickered for a moment. The stars outside seemed to warp, then shift, as if reality itself was bending. And then, the unmistakable voice of the Deathworlders rumbled through the structure. Adam froze. The sound was deep and guttural, vibrating through the walls like a tremor. He could feel it in his bones. The creatures were still here, just outside, circling, waiting. "They followed us," Sarah whispered, her voice shaky but determined. "They never stopped." Adam's eyes snapped toward the distant horizon of stars. The shelter's exterior had shifted. Instead of a simple escape, the environment around them had become chaotic, an endless, shifting web of energy, stars, and unknown forces. The Deathworlders were now in pursuit, their massive forms slowly drawing closer. "We need to make a decision," Adam said, turning toward his team. "We can't stay here. If they're this close, they won't stop until they find us. And we don't know what this ship really is or where it's taking us. Sarah's gaze was fixed on the horizon of stars, her face pale. But if we run, where do we go? What if we just keep running, and they follow us for the rest of our lives? Adam swallowed hard. He knew that the Deathworlders wouldn't relent. These creatures were relentless, intelligent, powerful, and driven by some unknown purpose. He could feel it deep in his gut. The pursuit wouldn't stop until either they were wiped out or they figure out why these monsters had targeted them in the first place. But what was the alternative? "We have to try something," Adam said, his voice tight. "We can't keep running forever. We have to face them, make them understand that we're not their enemies." Sarah turned to him, her face twisted with doubt. "You really think they'll listen?" Adam didn't answer immediately. He looked back at the console, where the glowing symbols flickered again. There was something about them, something that felt like a command, a signal, as if the shelter was trying to tell him something. He reached out once more, his fingers trembling as he pressed a series of buttons, activating a sequence that he didn't fully understand. The walls of the shelter hummed again, this time with a deep, resonating sound, like a deep, throbbing pulse. And then a voice, clear, authoritative, and alien, filled the shelter. It wasn't from the Deathworlders. This voice was something entirely different. Initiating, final choice. Your fate lies in the balance of survival and understanding. Choose your course. Choose wisely. The team exchanged bewildered looks, their confusion matching Adam's. What was this voice, and why had it spoken now? "The final choice," Sarah repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Adam turned back to the console, a new understanding forming. Whatever this shelter was, it wasn't just a place. It was a living entity, something beyond their comprehension. The Deathworlders were drawn to it for a reason, but now, the shelter itself had presented them with a choice. Their next move would determine everything. He looked back at his team, his voice firm despite the uncertainty gnawing at him. "We have one chance to make it out of this alive. We need to face the Deathworlders and find out why they came here. If we don't, we'll be running for the rest of our lives, and they'll hunt us down until there's nothing left." The team nodded, their resolve slowly solidifying. They had no choice but to confront whatever lay ahead. Adam's fingers hovered over the final button on the console, the one that could either take them to safety or doom them forever. With a deep breath, he pressed it. The walls around them trembled violently as the voice spoke once more, this time with a sense of finality. "The decision is made. Your survival is now intertwined with the fate of the Deathworlders. Welcome to the beginning of your new path." And with that, the shelter lurched forward, plunging them into the unknown once again.